After that, she'd done everything they'd asked. They had drunk potions they'd given her, done the hours of agonizing exercises, forced herself to think the way they wanted her to. They told her to imagine herself as clay being shaped and molded on the potter's wheel, her form amorphous and changeable. They told her to reach down into the objects they'd given her, to imagine them as living things, and to draw out the spirit that animated them. It had taken weeks, and the first time she had changed, it had been so blindingly painful that she'd vomited and passed out. When she'd woke, she'd been lying on one of the mouldering chases in the Dark Sister's room, a damp towel being sponged across her face. Miss Black had been leaning down over her, her breath as bitter as vinegar, and her eyes alight. "You did well today, Teresa," she had said. "Very well." That evening, when Tessa had gone up to her room, there had been gifts for her, 2 new books on her side table. Somehow the Dark Sisters had realized that reading and novels were Tessa's passion. There was a copy of Great Expectations and, of all things, Little Women. Tessa had hugged the books to herself, alone and unwatched in her room, and had let herself cry. It had grown easier since then, the changing. Tessa still didn't understand what happened inside her to make it possible, but she had memorized a series of steps that the Dark Sisters had taught her, the way a blind person might memorize the number of paces it takes to walk from their bed to the door of their room. She didn't know what was around her in the strange, dark place they asked her to journey to, but she knew the pathway through it. She drew on those memories now, tightening her grip on the ragged pink fabric she held. She opened her mind and let the darkness come down, let the connection that bound her to the hair ribbon and the spirit inside it, the ghostly echo of a person who had once owned it, unraveled like a golden thread leading through the shadows. The room she was in, the oppressive heat, the noisy breathing of the Dark Sisters, all of it fell away as she followed the thread, and the light grew more intense around her, and she wrapped herself in it as if she were wrapping herself in a blanket. Her skin began to tingle and to sting with thousands of tiny shocks. This had been the worst part once, the part where they had convinced her she was dying. Now she was used to it, and bore it stoically as she shuddered all over, from her scalp to her toes. The clockwork angel around her throat seemed to tick faster, as if in rhythm with her beating heart. The pressure inside her skin built. Tessa gasped, and her eyes, which had been closed, flew open as the sensation built to a crescendo, and then vanished. It was over. Tessa blinked dizzily. The first moment after a change was always like blinking water out of your eyes after submerging yourself in a bath. She looked down at herself. Her new body was slight, almost frail, and the fabric of her dress hung loose, pulling on the floor at her feet. Her hands clasped in front of her were pale and thin, with chapped lips and bitten nails, unfamiliar, alien hands. "What is your name?" Miss Black demanded. She had risen to her feet and was looking down at Tessa with pale eyes burning. She looked almost hungry. Tessa didn't have an answer. The girl whose skin she wore answered for her, speaking through the way spirits were said to speak through the mediums, but Tessa hated to think about it that way. The change was so much more intimate, so much more frightening than that. "Emma," the voice that came from Tessa said. "Miss Emma Bayliss, ma'am." "And who are you, Emma Bayliss?" the voice replied, words tumbling out of Tessa's mouth, bringing strong images to them. Born in Cheapside, Emma had been one of 6 children. Her father was dead and her mother sold peppermint water from a cart in East End. Emma had learned to sew and bring money when she was still a small child. Nights she spent sitting at the table in her kitchen, sewing seams by the light of a tallow candle. Sometimes, when the candle burned out, there was no money for another. She would go out into the streets, sit below one of the municipal gas lamps, and use its light to sew by. "Is that what you were doing out in the street that night, Emma Bayliss?" asked Miss Dark. She was smiling thinly now, running her tongue over her lips as if she could sense what the answer could be. Tessa saw narrow, shadowy streets wrapped in a thick fog. A silver needle, working by faint yellow gaslight, a step muffled in the